Well, welcome everybody to Paul Ruedi's On the Money Show. I'm glad to be here with Dr. Fred Gerst. Dr. Fred missing in action last time.
Good to be back.
And glad to have you in here. Never seen two guys sweat so much, Fred, because my son David's not here, so there's only two of us. We're afraid that Fred doesn't show up. What are we going to do?
Special father-in-law and son-in-law.
That's true, yes. Isn't it nice? And certified financial planner. Well, I almost read David's name. Certified Financial Planner Professional Ryan Repko, who works with me at Ruedi Wealth Management as well. You can call in with your questions or tell us, I had to put in last show's beginning and we were talking about charitable, but we already did that. You can call in with your questions at 356-9397 or text us on the Castle Heating and Cooling text line at 351-5357. No Facebook Live today, but we will try to record it and put the video on our social media pages at ruediwealth.com. It's important to recognize that past performance is not an indication of future results. You should get out of breath. You should not make any investment decisions without first consulting your own financial advisor and conducting your own due diligence. Just as an aside, we'll have another show, Fred, I don't know if I've told you this, on the 17th instead of, might have been Christmas Day or 24th.
A week from today.
Yeah, so we're all good there. Sounds like everybody will be here. Well, 266,000 jobs, Fred, in the last report. Nobody's really talking about recession anymore.
No, we've had these kind of mini swings. We don't actually have recessions, but we have the fear of recession rising. And probably 6 weeks ago or so, people were talking about that. But now we have things lining up in an unusually good kind of array here. The strong job growth, also not surprisingly, lowest unemployment since the 1960s. We also have wage growth, which didn't happen in the early stages of the recovery. And the thing that's been true all along is low inflation. So all these things have lined up. People used to talk about a misery index of adding together the unemployment rate plus the inflation rate. And back in the early 80s, we had a 25% misery index. Now we have like a 2% inflation rate and a 3.5% unemployment rate, which is unheard of in probably the last 100 years.
And you mentioned wage gains. Average hourly earnings rose by 3.1% from a year ago, again, in kind of a 2% inflation world. So really, real wages, net, even above inflation, are really, still accelerating quite a bit. And of course, it seems to be pretty broad-based. It seems like everybody's participating, even though what's the other participation rate? Maybe that's what it's called. Kind of the ones that people
out everyone in the age category, right?
Right. Even that's making progress, but it sure seems like I'm sure depending if you listen to politicians would tell you this is the big best boom ever. I don't think that, but in terms of employment, it's certainly got to be up there with one.
Well, it depends how you count it. If you count it in terms of time, it's the longest in history. But if people have been listening for 10 years or more, we always talked about the very, very slow recovery. So it came out very slowly and it's lasted for a long time. And this is all in the context of still a modest growth rate. We're not only growing around 2%, which isn't great by historical standards, but it shows that all these good things are happening within that context. There's always a kind of cloud on the horizon here. The fact is that we can't keep increasing the employment, the jobs number, unless people start coming back into the workforce, because once you get down to 3% unemployment, 3.5% unemployment, there aren't a lot of people around who are seeking a job who don't have a job. So the only way to get new jobs is not to get unemployed people back to work, but to get people back into the workforce who previously weren't in there.
Is that why we're seeing the kind of the wage growth we're seeing
Probably so, yeah,
above and beyond inflation?
Tightness, yeah, right.
But not really enough to worry, at least doesn't seem like, about overall inflation. It doesn't seem to have put, there's probably a lot of offsetting forces, I'm guessing,
right,
when it comes to inflation. Wages can be a big component of it, but there's all these other offsetting, either disinflationary or probably some sectors deflationary parts of the world. Well, I see Tall Paul. You know who Tall Paul is, Paul Volcker, who was appointed Fed chairman by Jimmy Carter. I think some people forget that Jimmy Carter was the one that actually appointed Paul Volcker, who was the Fed chair in 1979. He was renominated by Reagan in 1983 and served until 1987. He died, and I remind people that the inflation rate was 1% under President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, but got up to almost 15%, 14.8% in March of 1980. So basically, am I correct if I told people Paul Volcker is the one who single-handedly shot inflation in the head and just basically threw us into a recession because of it? Probably knew he was going to throw us into a recession. Fred, is that because when you get these periods, continuing periods of extraordinary higher inflation, that people begin to basically bake that into the cake, start behaving as if, how they spend
the
money,
argument
et
is
cetera?
if you want to stop inflation, you have to not just get a little tighter, you have to reduce expectations, and reducing expectations is often painful, and the pain in those days was a recession. And the credit obviously goes to Volcker, but also to both to President Carter and President Reagan. They were willing to accept that. It may have, it probably didn't cost Carter the election, but certainly made it more difficult for him. And people may be sort of surprised, but Ronald Reagan actually continued that and weathered a fairly serious recession in the early 80s because of that. So you had two presidents who were willing to take some pain to get to where we want to be, which is quite unlike today. We have a situation now where we have interest rates close to zero, all these good things happening, and the president's calling for lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, which isn't exactly the path that Volcker followed, or Reagan or Carter.
There's probably a whole generation of people that don't realize that by the time Paul Volcker was done, he took the Fed funds rate, which is the overnight lending, liquidity rate in the banking system, to over 22%. Today it's about what, 1% or 1.5% these days.
Yeah, he has a sort of charmed life. I guess two people, Volcker and Greenspan, both while they were in office, got very high marks. Obviously, after Greenspan left, things kind of degenerated. But both of those Fed chairmen, who had a lot of autonomy, did in retrospect, a good job. The only kind of knock against Volcker was he was also the kind of mastermind of the situation where we had wage and price controls under Reagan, and some things which, under Nixon, which probably in retrospect are probably not particularly good ideas.
Do you think those were his ideas, or he just went along?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, there was inside thing, but my understanding was that he was a close advisor to John Connally, and John Connally had a lot of influence on President Nixon, more so than the Chicago economists, who didn't think it was a good idea at the time. So again, that's only the story. I don't know what actually happened in real time.
Well, 1 in 10 people by the time it was done were unemployed. He was pretty much vilified. One trade publication, I think it was the Tennessee Builders Association or something like that, posted a wanted picture of him, and they really wrote some pretty nasty stuff. But then I think everybody saw, the results spoke for themselves and said, okay, well, we vilified him, but at the end of the day,
that's an argument for the autonomy of the central bank, the Federal Reserve. One of the arguments that, and I think a lot of people believe, that if you have central banks that aren't under the thumb of the political sector, you have more ability to do these kind of things, which in this case probably proved correct, because again, Volcker with Trump as president might be a different world.
And he got back involved under Obama administration during the financial crisis, where he was critical of the banks and the banking system.
Well, I think he was, in that sense, he was critical, but I think he was more or less used as a front man to the Volcker rule. Was a way of getting it passed. If it hadn't been the Volcker rule about banks being reined in a little bit, it probably wouldn't ever become a rule at all. So he was used as a kind of way of furthering that particular idea.
Well, I read somewhere where he developed his hatred for inflation because he went off to Princeton after his two sisters did.
Yeah.
And his mom gave him $25 a month to spend, and he rebelled and said, "That's not enough, Mom." And so the story goes, he said, "Well, that's what your sister's got, and that's what you're going to get." He said, "But they went during the Depression, and there was
Right.
deflation. Now there's inflation, it costs more."
Right.
So he tried to lobby his sisters. They agreed with Paul Volcker, but Mom overrode it. Said, "Well,
Yeah.
$25 is what it is." So I
Yeah.
guess that's how he got his distaste and dislike.
Yeah, well,
for
Princeton must have been a
inflation.
good place. George Shultz went there about the same time, and he was one of the people in the Nixon administration who opposed the wage and price controls.
What were they thinking when they were doing wage and price controls? Not that
Well-
these days people are that interested, but it's kind of looking past. It wasn't that far ago. The pretty
No.
radical policies.
But we still, tried it again with oil embargo situations in the 70s and so on. I think the argument, if you want to give it a good spin, I think everyone knew that wage and price controls are not a way of dealing with inflation over a long period of time, but it may be a way of breaking inflationary expectations. So I think the argument was, we'll impose this for 6 months. It will get the idea out of people's mind that you always have to incorporate inflation into your planning, and that may have been the reason for it.
But I can't imagine that anybody, maybe it's easy to look back now, but even just understanding basic economics 101, where you would think that price controls as
Well,
opposed to market basis.
Again, maybe it's vilifying someone who's long gone, but John Connolly was not an economist. He was a guy who wanted to get things done, kind of in the style of Lyndon Johnson. So who cares? It was wage and price controls or whatever. Let's take some action and make things
do something.
happen. Yeah.
Oh, got it. We're going to shift a little bit. I read an article from the Insured Retirement Institute. Fred, feel free to weigh in on any of these because I think they're all pretty basic. But that's a trade body for the annuity industry, and it says most boomers are unprepared for retirement, even as they approach or enter. Well, we know that. Amazingly, barely 1 in 10 has enough saved up. I'm not sure that's the case. It may be, it may not be. It's not.
Well, just to break in, there's this kind of golf that everyone before retirement is in dire straits. They haven't saved enough. They didn't do their planning. But then once you get to retirees, most retirees actually are doing pretty well. So there's kind of a disconnect there between people planning and people actually living. I mean, it used to be that the highest poverty rate was among the elderly. Now it's the very lowest rate. And there's subsidized healthcare, things of that sort. So it's planning still is really great, but it's not necessarily true that almost everyone who's retiring is totally ill-equipped for it.
And if I look back at my 35 years, and Ryan, you see this all the time when you see us meet, you and I meet with clients for the first time, a prospective client. I think 90% of them think they don't have anywhere near enough money saved, and probably 90% of those have at least enough or more than they thought when it comes to what that means for our standard of living. So I think a lot of it is just, doesn't it seem like most people, even when we tell them like what their spend could be, that they're doubtful at first?
Yeah, certainly. I think a lot of folks kind of downplay the relevance that Social Security will eventually play in their life, so they look at that and they may kind of forget or not emphasize it as much, and they look at the assets they've saved up maybe in their 401k or outside accounts, and they just say, there's no way I can live on this for the rest of my life. The other thing that most folks can't truly comprehend is the value of growth over time in their accounts, and the compound interest is going to do wonders for them in a retirement that could likely be 30 years, and that will play a big part into their assets as well. So they're looking, I think, at a statement which is flat,
Right.
whereas we're looking at something over 30 years which is dynamic.
That in our mind we see a different picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it also seems, Fred and Ryan, that people have a concept of how much money they're going to need that's formed by their current salary. So you take a two-person household, 2 partners, husband and spouse, trying to be politically correct these days. I try to cover all the bases.
Spouse one,
So
spouse
a
two.
dual earner, let's just say a dual earning income couple, and so say maybe together they make $80,000. You say, hey, what's your combined income? And they're thinking, well, our gross salary, I make 30, and she makes 40 or what? Well, I guess 50. And automatically they're anchored to that 80,000 number, and so they might see Social Security. Well, okay, Social Security's $2,000 a month or $2,500 between us, and they see this big gap. But that's why we most of the time say, okay, well, let's get a better concept. But what's your take-home pay by the time you pay for health care and put money in a retirement plan and pay your taxes and all that stuff? How much is actually getting deposited? People usually have a pretty good handle at that. That's a much lower number, obviously. And then I think that's where part of the gap is in this divide, if you ask people. I see we have a caller. We have Stan. All right, Stan. Welcome to Paul Ruedi's On the Money. Yes, sir. Just once in a while, Stan? Once in a while? Come on now. All right, go ahead, Stan. All right. I know. No, I can tell you that because there were 16% mortgages. There were 16% CDs. I remember them because I was in the, I was studying this stuff at the time. So that I have no doubt about that high Fed funds rate, because what was happening at that time, you might remember, Stan, is so even in the early 80s, I couldn't convince anybody when you could go buy a 30-year strip treasury, which means it didn't pay you interest every 6 months or periodically. It was a zero coupon bond, and you could buy it for around 17% a year for the next 30 years. Nobody wanted it. You know why? Because money markets were paying 21 or 22%. So that's indelibly etched in my brain. It's called an inverted yield curve, Stan. That's the thing everybody was concerned about, obsessed about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks ago, was the fact that short-term rates were higher than long-term rates. It happens. It's called an inverted yield curve, and it happened. Well, I'd bet on me, Stan. I would bet on me if I were you today. And that's really what, when you think it all the way through, that deep, of an inverted yield curve is going to forecast not only a recession, a very steep recession. And until 2008, 2009, that was the worst recession we had since the 20s and 30s. So it all makes sense to me. Why do you get to pick? Why? I'll bet you lunch. You just call me at my office when I win. Anyway, go ahead. Thanks, Dan. Please do.
Yeah.
And if you do, call us back and make me right.
Yeah, that reminds me of we're talking about really old days, almost 40 years ago now, but one of my first investments was I bought a CD guaranteed 12%,
Yeah.
compounded for 10 years, plus I got like a 10% bonus when I went in, and it worked out fine, except the savings loan that sold it to me obviously went bankrupt.
Of course. But that was, by 89, that was the savings and loan crisis.
Yeah.
I remember that so well. I was in the business, and, potential clients would come in and say, well, what's the expected return of my stock portfolio? I don't know, somewhere around 10% or so. Well, I'd get 9 or 10 or 11% in a CD. And you think, well, kind of hard to argue with that, other than what happened. A lot of them got called back. And
well, the good thing was for me, but the bad thing for the country was that we had the moral hazard that I didn't have to worry about the soundness of my financial institution because I knew the federal government would step in.
And after a while, though, they finally got to a point, though, Fred, on some of them where they said, you know what, we're not going to pay you that rate.
Yeah.
In fact, so like anything, it was kind of a too good to be true situation. And of course, that was the Milken days, Michael Milken. And he was big behind the savings and loan crisis, or a lot of people.
Well, it's also that we were the beneficiary of Volcker because it was purchased when the expected inflation rate was 12% or so.
Of course.
And then it came down. So if it were a normal bond, it would have gone up
of course.
A huge amount in value.
I agree. So anyway, I'm 99% sure, Stan, that I'm right on this one. Okay, so the first one we're getting back to, here are the 7 things in the article, and they all make sense to me. We're not going to spend too much time on them because I think they're all, some of them are like, okay, duh. Not saving enough or anything. It's the most obvious, but it's worth repeating, according to the article. An astonishing 23% of baby boomers have no retirement savings and never did. I don't know, Fred, do you think versus 40 years ago, were the people their age, youngins, saving any more? I don't know if we don't
I
have the
think
data, but
well, I think it's come back a little bit, but the sad fact is that significant minority of people live pretty close to the margin while they're working, and they also live pretty close to the margin once they retire, and they don't have much savings anytime. So that's, it may be true, but the people that we're talking to here probably are not in that category, or if they are in that category, they need to change their behaviors.
right.
And two kinds of behaviors. One is to save more, the other is to find a way to make more income. Both of those work.
I think that's a challenge to the working poor, which
Yeah.
describes an awful lot of people.
Right.
Is they're having a hard time making ends meet, or maybe they're not making ends meet, and then to suggest that they put 1 or 2 or even 3% of their salary away,
Right.
that's a very real human condition that I think it's easy for some people to say, well, everybody could do it and should do it, and that probably is true.
Right.
I've always felt like if everybody, when they got their first job, whatever salary comes out of their person hiring mouth, is you just multiply it by 0.95, and just as if they told you instead of 30,000 a year, it's somewhere around 27,500, 28,000, and that the difference would go into savings. And if you started out that way, where 5% of your gross salary was going away, again, it doesn't really address the issue of the working poor, but
Well, you talk about your some of your clients and some of your newer clients that end up with relatively modest paying job all their lives, and yet they end up with substantial
they
assets.
walk in the door, Fred, people that never made a big amount of money, but here's what they did. They still got some of their kids educated. They rarely bought new cars. They rarely bought cars, period. If they did, it was used. Most of them, or many of them, still live in the same house they bought when they were struggling young people raising a family. They didn't go on Facebook vacations. By that I mean braggable vacations, and they just kind of blindly put their money, a certain amount of money, away in a 401k or type of plan, and just over a 30 to 40 year period, even modest amounts of money, compounding it somewhere in the area of 10 or 11% per year. One day you wake up and you're 55 or 60 and you have $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, and they couldn't even explain to you sometimes where it really came from, and they can hardly believe it themselves. So I'm convinced that about the only way out for people is once they get their first job. Ed Charlotte always said it. I just remember him when I was younger, and he was younger, and maybe it was his economic seminars. He always talked about paying yourself first and how right he was and is. The next one is draining your retirement savings. Another 17% did save for the retirement once, but spent their money either in desperation or carelessness or both. A lot of times it's desperation.
Yeah.
You see that, Ryan, and it's not just young people, it's people in their 50s or mid-50s. Something happens, but it really gets in the way. This is one that not calculating is number 3, a retirement savings goal. I've always said if your money isn't pointed towards something, and it could be a pretty wide guess, as the distribution of outcomes of just what our return might be over the next 30 years is pretty wide. But, and Ryan's heard me say this on the front end of client meetings before, look, a lot of times we're just guessing on the front end, but let's just try to fence it in a little bit, and then we'll refine it and move the fence a little closer. Do you ever have friends that call you that that you went to college with that are raiding their 401ks, just as an aside? Ryan?
No, thankfully not.
You're not doing it, are you?
No.
There's
I was gonna say I've been lectured too good about that from my first days and my first job about the importance of saving and saving early. But no, generally the folks that do tap their 401k are those folks that fall into some dire financial straits. Occasionally you see folks who do it, but it can be a real record because oftentimes you pay that extra 10% penalty for early withdrawal, and of course you're not saving while you're withdrawing. So
And one of them that's not on here that comes to me though, that kind of is a cousin to that one, is they don't have a reserve fund.
Yep.
And we talk so often, Fred and Ryan, about, it's important to have both, but really try to get those reserves to a decent amount. Prioritize that. You still want to put money in a 401k that's matched, okay? But you might just keep it at that until you have that reserve. You don't add extra money to a 401k plan or a 403b plan.
right.
So a lot of the problems that I see in here, or some of them, are just related to not having reserves or a strategy to put up with life's curveballs. Underestimating healthcare costs, there's number one. Here's a sober item. A 2018 analysis estimated that a healthy couple in their mid-60s may need to budget between $1.3 and $500,000 million for their healthcare expenses. I think those things are, as a rule, way overblown. It happens, but the probability of that's pretty low. But healthcare costs are an issue, particularly for people that want to retire prior to 65 and on Medicare.
I think
That goes right into ignoring long-term care costs. It's pretty much everybody that walks to our door now. It's like, and what about long-term care? I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. The one thing from this survey that caught me the most off guard was this topic about ignoring long-term care costs, and it said that roughly 46% of baby boomers who were surveyed thought that Medicare was going to cover the cost of their long-term care expenses, and Medicare doesn't pick up a dime of long-term care expenses. So for folks who are in that boat thinking that Medicare is there for that need, it is not. So you do have to at least plan for it or be aware that you may go into a facility where you may not have first pick simply because you don't have assets to support the cost of long-term care, because again, Medicare doesn't fund that.
Another one, and I see this, is mishandling your retirement date. 31% of boomers predict they'll work past 70, but studies found fewer than 10% actually do. So that can have material impact.
Sure.
If you end up working 10 years, you're doing all this modeling and your savings, and this is what I think I'm going to earn. I think it's really wise to run some scenarios for people that are doing it on their own of what happens if I'm forced. And there's lots of reasons people get forced to out of the working zone, and not setting affairs and orders. Well, that's not that exciting to me. I'm not going to go into that one. But going into the end of the year, Paul Jr. writes a checklist every year, and he did his list for 2019. You can go to our website at ruediwealth.com. 36 different tips, things to consider. That's too overwhelming. 6 categories. We'll hit some.
There's a real, I just read a behavioral economics book, and every list should be at least 5 and no more than 9. And
Okay.
seven is the ideal number, because people can only handle.
Okay, so
7
today
things.
we're going to say 7 things you need to think about before the year end, and I think that probably will cover a lot of them. But the categories themselves are investments, retirement accounts, taxation, insurance, estate planning, and general financial planning. So there we have 6.
And I think to Paul's credit, if we broke these up individually, each one of these would be about 6 or 7. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he knew
Yeah, one at a
precisely
time.
that.
So I want to hit the big ones, and ones I see people that they don't really pay enough attention to, or they do it backwards. One is review your asset allocation. Check your mix of stocks versus bonds. Is it still aligned with your goals? Well, most people are going to go, well, I think so. How do I know? Well, if you have a trusted advisor who's competent, they should always be looking at your asset allocation to make sure that you're not biting off more uncertainty than you actually need, which is another way of saying you have more invested in the stock market that you actually need to do everything you want to do. I'm going to leave some of these out. Asset location. You might do an inventory or ask somebody, even if you hire somebody for an hour, an independent person who's knowledgeable, and say, do I have the right types of mutual funds in the right type of accounts? In other words, do I have my least tax efficient investments in my tax deferred accounts, and my most tax efficient investments in my personal brokerage account, and maybe my highest octane, highest expected return things in a Roth account? Asset allocation is much more, it's probably 19 is to 1 more important than tax location, but it's picking up a few more pennies on the ground that are there. Rebalancing, key. Ryan, I think we all have a very similar approach in our office, because we basically have a tight philosophy. Everybody, if you ask any of us a question, you're probably going to get the same answer and the same strategy out of all of us. Maybe one that's a little squishy is when you rebalance. I tend to do it when the plan calls for it, but sometimes we do it just because you guys actually practice for all of our clients. You have the software and the technology and the algorithms that kind of do it when it's needed. Is that right?
Yeah, we're agnostic to, you know, rebalancing because the client wants to run up and let's see how far the account goes. We say, no, that's not appropriate. We do it when the account grows above or below where it should be. So for some folks who come into this, they say, well, the market's running up. I don't want to sell the stuff that's doing well and put it into the stuff by contrast that may be not doing as well, for example, like bonds. So right now we're seeing all-time highs are quite near. And so it's contrary for so many people to think, why would I get out of the good stuff and buy back some of the bad stuff? Because eventually, at some point, we don't know if it's today, tomorrow, or 6 months from now, there's going to be some sort of change, and we don't want to gamble with house money for to use a lack of a better term.
Right.
It's appropriate to make sure that if you're invested in a percentage allocation of stocks to bonds, that it stays roughly in that balance as the market does fluctuate.
What about watching? This is the time of year, it seems, that a lot of mutual funds pay their biggest distributions, kind of mid, and it's a wide range, but I would say December.
Yep.
And talk to people about if they're thinking about investing, what to be careful about.
So what happens is they start paying out capital gains and dividends in these funds, and what you don't want to do is set yourself up for higher tax bills by buying it without the dividend. And there's a date in line called the ex-dividend date, and you don't want to buy it and then not receive the dividend but have to pay the tax on it. So you can just watch the ex-dividend dates. They're all listed and they're generally publicized in advance. So make sure that you're aware of that if you're buying mutual funds.
Yeah, and I think whether you get it or not is the date of record. There's a date just before that says, hey, if you own the shares after this date, you are going to get that dividend. So you want to check, just make sure anything. If you're thinking about doing some investing in December in a taxable type of account,
right.
Personal brokerage account. For that behavioral issue, just always never seems to go away.
Right.
We think of rebalancing as being it should just be automated and all that, but
Yeah.
it sure seems like people want to do the opposite. They want to rebalance towards the things that are working well,
Sure.
doing
It
well.
does make a lot of sense to a naive person to say, this has been a great investment the last 5 years, get out of it. Or get out at least by part way, which again is not intuitive, but it's over the long run, it's the right thing to do unless
Unless your needs change.
or unless you just decide to put everything into stocks and let it ride.
And when I see, especially in this epic low interest rate environment, call it the last 10 years, is clients don't like bonds that aren't paying much after
Yeah.
taxes and inflation. Of course, for most people in retirement that are making withdrawals from their strategy, having 100% in the stock market, it may have the highest expected return, but it's a way to literally go broke.
Right.
So for most people, it's going to require some of their portfolio in bonds. But even if it's a modest portion, 20 or 30% in bonds, it really becomes something they get quite uncomfortable about.
Right.
Simply from the fact that, well, the stock market went up over 20% this year, and bonds earned 2 or 3 or 4% this year. I like 20 better than 4. And you try to remind them that there's a difference between people that are investing a lump sum for the next 20 or 30 years versus where investment returns going to be really important, versus if we're withdrawing from our portfolio in our retirement, it's not the investor's returns that become important. It's the investor's wealth. It's a completely different story, and you really have to be careful. But people really hate.
Well, they probably weren't saying that in 2008 and 2009.
No, in 2000, right? In 2009, 10, 11, 12, they were saying, how come we have so much money in the stock market still? It's suddenly in the last few years been, how come we have so much money in the bond market? This is just the essence of human nature.
Right.
And what causes people problems. Hey, Mike texted me, sent a text on the Castle Heating and Cooling text line. I must say that. Mike says, I'm betting on you too, Paul. As Stan was told many years ago, you're entitled to your opinions, but not your facts. Well, thanks, Mike. I like your confidence in me. So from a retirement, contribute to your traditional IRA. So if you don't have a 401k plan, you use a traditional IRA, contribute a maximum of $6,000 per year. If you're 50 or older, another $1,000. You can also think about doing a Roth IRA. Again, there's some income limitations sometimes, but if you can do it, and then if you're self-employed, you can look at SEP IRAs. Probably makes sense this time of year going into next year to review your savings rate and retirement accounts. Ryan, wouldn't it just be sensible to say, okay, if I'm putting in 5% this year, maybe when I see wage growth of 3.1%, just kind of nationally for just showing up for your job, would it make sense for to say, look, all right, you keep 2 of it and put an extra 1%?
Yep, certainly. Again, it's just about having good practices and habits. You don't grow into that new amount of income coming in because of a wage growth. You start saving more and a little more, and again, it's a split. It doesn't have to be all or none, but just getting in the habit of making sure that as new money comes in and your salary grows, that you also grow your savings.
What do you tell your friends are pretty affluent? A lot of them are doctors, etc. But they're your age, they're in the low 30s. Do they ever ask you how much they should be putting in their retirement plans? Does that ever come up?
Not generally. I think most of them are kind of like maxing out anyway. But when some folks who are like other groups ask what I'm doing, say, well, it's a minimum pick up the amount of contribution that your employer offers if you have a match. And then you look at how much income you have and you say, well, could you go up, if you could contribute, let's say 10%, that would be maybe an ideal, plus a match, maybe you're somewhere in a range of 10 to 13, 14%. That's a very, very healthy savings rate. For most folks, that's pretty substantial. It's not always doable for everybody, but in just using kind of rule of thumbs, which I know we try to avoid because everyone's situation is unique, but anywhere between the 10 and 15% range is a very healthy savings rate.
And one other one, I think we're going to do that. You just want to make sure you take out your required minimum distribution. If you're required to do so, the penalties are pretty heinous, Fred. 50% if you mess it up and don't take out.
I have like a asterisk associated with that. I learned a lot of things by maybe not doing it exactly right, but
We all do, Fred.
I always, when I didn't have a required minimum distribution, I took nothing out. And you probably should start doing it even before you have to, if you can take advantage of low marginal tax rates. So now, even though I don't have to, I'm actually converting traditional into a Roth and paying the tax on it,
Right.
Because the rates are somewhat lower than they were, and they may go up in the future. So if you have unused
Marginal tax bracket.
you might as well even take it out ahead of time.
I think we'll probably talk about that because that takes us in. That's a good segue into the tax part. This is kind of an important one. Gather all your tax-related documents. That's pretty obvious. But sell appreciated assets to take advantage of low tax rates. So you may have some unrealized capital gains in your portfolio. We do this frequently, particularly for new retirees that have this personal brokerage account that they can live off of. In the meanwhile, they're not forced to take the required minimum distributions. Maybe they're deferring or delaying their Social Security. So they have plenty of money to spend, but they don't have a high taxable income in many times. And we'll look at those situations. We're going to do one of two things. We're going to look at doing the Roth conversion strategy, as you talked about, at very low rates, but sometimes we're able to harvest capital gains at a 0% tax rate. And you're never going to pay lower than a 0% tax rate. So I think we all think about harvesting losses for the year for tax purposes, but I rarely find anybody who thinks about harvesting capital gains.
I think there's probably a lot of folks who aren't even aware that you can harvest or pay a 0% gain. So I think maybe there's just not the awareness in the first place. So it is a good opportunity.
Yeah, so you can gift appreciated assets to those in lower tax brackets. Remember, you can gift up to $15,000 a year to take advantage of your yearly exemption. Now, there's one probably more confusion about that issue. If I had to pick the most common misunderstanding, it would be how much money we can give people. People think because we have that $15,000 limit, there's a problem if you give somebody more than $15,000. It's just becomes a tracking issue. We're all allowed to give away a certain amount of money over our lifetime. If you give more than that $15,000 to any one person, you gotta let your accountant know that you did that, and it works against your lifetime exemptions.
And I think it's worth noting the exemptions are really high, and there's a sunset provision, but they're $11.4 million for a single individual and $22.8 million for a married couple. So for most Americans, you're never even going to hit those limits. I can say confidently I'm probably not going to be there either. I don't know about you, Dr. Fred. And,
Yeah.
but the advantage
Fred's never going to tell you. Fred's like
Yeah.
a stone man.
But you can give it also, even if it were important, which is very few people find it binding, but you could give away if you have, 2 children and 2 spouses of children and 4 grandchildren. You can give a huge amount away with that 15,000 because $15,000 per person, and both spouses can also do that. So you could probably, and your family, you could probably give away a couple $100,000 a year without even
I
buying
don't
return.
like my kids, but it is funny to watch people's reaction because if they start thinking about, well, we might want to give them more than 15,000. I said, well, let me tell you how much you could give them with all these different, just as you laid out. They almost always are like, oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to give them that much money. And we just didn't really understand that if we want to give somebody 20,000 and that you could do it. It's just make charitable donations. And again, we might remind you, since we're also kind of in this tax, it's if you're 70 and a half and you're getting required minimum distributions, you can use those required minimum distributions, qualified charitable deduction.
But only from an IRA.
Distribution, I mean.
Only from an IRA.
Only from an IRA, not
so
from a 401k.
You have to. You can create. Most places allow you to create an IRA and roll money over from the 401k or the 403b into an IRA, which then makes it possible to do this.
Yeah.
And if you've made commitments, maybe like a 5-year commitment to a charitable organization, and maybe you're going to pay $10,000 a year over the next 5 years, maybe you try to put it all into, you could do it in a donor advised fund. If you, well, actually, I'm mixing some things up. If you don't know where you're going to, but you're going to be a person that is quite charitable, and you can lump all that into 1 year and put it in a donor advised fund with one of the major brokerage firms, Fidelity, Schwab's, you name it. Most of them can accommodate it.
But you have to be itemizing to do that.
Correct.
And,
And
you can't roll in the qualified plans into a donor advised plan.
Correct, but so from your taxable money though, and appreciated assets, whatever you want, you can lump it all into 1 year so that you get that itemized deduction. Whereas if you spread it out over the 5 years, then you might not qualify for the itemized deduction. So it's just something to think about, and there's donor advised funds to do that. You can always try to pay 2020 expenses ahead of time. Getting pretty sterile, huh? So those are some. I'm going to go over some other basic ones. Review your insurance policies. Is the coverage still adequate? These are still worth mentioning. Review your beneficiaries. There's a big one where, I would say 1 or 2 out of 10 people probably don't have the beneficiary listed from experience that they thought they have, particularly if there's a divorce and some of those issues. If you have the ability to do a health savings account, you want to make sure you're taking advantage of that. And if you have the ability to use up your flexible spending account balance, you want to make sure you don't leave that.
If we could go back to that beneficiaries, I think that's one of the biggest things and one of the easiest things that someone can correct at the year end, because it has such huge implications. And if you, like you brought up, if you did have a divorce in the family and you have maybe an ex-spouse still on your beneficiary and you have kids, there is the possibility that if something happens to you, that money then goes to the ex-spouse and not to your kids. And you would like to think that the money goes to where you want it to when you pass, and you can put yourself in control very easily by looking at your investment accounts, whether it's your 401k, your IRA, or 403b, and just ensure that they have the correct beneficiary that you want on there today. It's an easy thing to forget during the midst of maybe family turmoil, and it's a simple thing to correct.
Well, and it's a simple thing to miss, especially if it's a unpleasant situation that's causing the need for a change of beneficiary. Sometimes that's the last thing that's thought about.
It's easily
and
the
all the
last
frustration and hurt
Yep.
and anger and all that stuff. So I think, what do you think? Everybody should ask their advice if they're working with an advisor, or if they have their money at Vanguard, or if you have qualified retirement accounts.
Yeah.
Just everybody do yourself a favor. It's a pain in the butt a little bit. If you have just one advisor, it's not hard. Clients ask us all the time to review theirs, and we always suggest that they review theirs to make sure. But make sure that before the year end this year, all your beneficiary designations are checked. I think that is a really important one. Of course, you might think, well, if it's been a while, you haven't dusted off your will for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, there may be some modest changes that you might want to contemplate with your estate planning attorney. Check beneficiaries, we've talked about that. Healthcare directives. I mean, probably 50% of the people that walk into our office don't have all their key documents, and one of them is, of course, your healthcare directives. You want to get that power of attorney done. It's easy, it's not expensive, it's almost free. And life insurance coverage, that's kind of ties in with beneficiaries, but do you still need it?
Yep.
If you're wondering, get somebody who's independent that doesn't sell insurance to, kind of work through the math of whether you need to keep it or not. And at the same time, find out is that if you do need it, do you have the adequate and the right type? Business continuity agreements, this of course applies to business people. Make sure that those documents as well. And I'm almost getting to an end, I promise. So
You're gonna need a water
this is the
after
final
all this.
one. Well, you know what? These aren't the most exciting things to think about, but I've been doing this for 35 years. If I walk down the street and tap people on the shoulder, I'll find that nobody goes through Paul's gauntlet and they have all these things done properly. Well, how about establishing a financial plan? It's a proven fact. The data shows that people with a financial plan, even if it's a basic one, tend to live more confident, happier, less worry-free lives. Just makes sense.
And if I can add a little something, I just went through a plan with one of our clients. I updated just this past week, and her comment to me was, wow, I had no idea all of this was being considered and accounted for and planned for behind the scenes of what you all do for us. And I said, oh yeah, this is why we have a plan, is that we have confidence going into it. And her comment was, I feel such a greater sense of relief now than before I walked in the door. And this is someone who's been with us a while, but yet still the amount of pressure release that having a plan in place can give you can be just so reassuring.
Especially after a couple of years go by, then I find out it's hard to get clients to come in and even talk to us.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I talk too much, but it's because they're like, no, everything's cool as long as you call me if there's trouble brewing. And I think that's an understated benefit. And of course, like I said, it's like a barber asking a barber if you need a haircut. They're always going to say yes, but the data's pretty clear, and it makes common sense. If you have someone who's competent, trustworthy, telling you when you need to spend more money, when you need to spend less, how much more, how much less, how are we going to deal with inflation if it starts rearing its head, how are we going to deal with, we know if we're retired, if a bad event happens to our portfolio in the first few years, that can cause permanent damage for retirement. How are we going to deal with what if we have below average returns? What should our beneficiary designations be? And what about long-term care? Just that constant reminder each year, we remind clients. And remember, we do throw in a long-term care goal into your plan just to make sure. And again, it's just a checklist that 2 or 3 years into it, they get pretty happy. Contribute to a 529 plan. So I do that myself. I guess I got to get off my duff and get one in for little Evan.
Oh yeah.
Update your budget if you have one, right? I mean, what would you guess, guys? How many people in America actually have a budget? I'd be surprised if it's 20%.
I was going to say, if it's a quarter, I'd say about half of those folks are lying. I think most people.
So harsh.
I know most people, I think, are human, and they spend what they spend, and they maybe look at it after the fact. And
what about all these apps? And I know Daniel was talking about a new one he really likes, and I forget what it was called. I want to say Clarity or something. And maybe Daniel on next show I'll mention it. But there's these mint.coms. There's these kind of aggregator apps that also have, if you're. What I've always liked to do is pretty much pay for everything on a credit card and pay it off at the end of the month. Because you're doing that, then it's so easy to download, or it automatically is downloaded into these budgeting apps. Daniel told me he's already spent $256 on Chick-fil-A this year. I mean, you know what? I would too. The lines are too long. I can't. It's like nobody goes there. The lines are too long.
There's going back to the behavioral. There's a question of efficiency versus discipline. The Dave Ramsey way is to put your money in envelopes and take out the envelopes, which is a very inefficient way of carrying out your activities, but it's a very constrained way. It keeps you from going out of control.
You can't cheat it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only so much money in the envelope. You're going to get called out.
You look silly walking into a restaurant with an envelope.
It's so hard to use cash anymore, too. People look at you like you're nuts.
And I think some of those apps have somewhat solved that problem, because they can send reminders to say, it looks like your goal of spending was this, and you spent X dollars more this week. You're not on target, or you are. So it gives you pulses, essentially.
And they're free apps.
And they're free.
You don't have to pay for them. So there's really not much an excuse other than you're just lazy.
Yeah.
Okay.
It could work both ways. I think if I had a budget, I probably would have saved less rather than more.
It certainly can work less. I can't, I'll admit I don't have a budget, but you know what, I'm at a point in my life where I've never had such low costs
Yeah.
and a really, you know, a handsome income, a decent income, and where it's,
Well, so-
but the fact, but I can monitor it because we do put virtually everything on a credit card.
But if people have a negative natural outlook, they may oversave, which is kind of a strange thing to say.
And it happens.
Yeah.
You know, and you're always juggling this, what about today, and needless sacrifice of, look, you're only in your 40s once, you're only in your 50s once. And ask anybody that's in the next decade, they wish they were your age and knew that. Well, I hope that helps people. And hire, by the way, the last one, imagine this, hire a financial advisor. Doesn't even have to be us. Do yourself a favor, talk to 2 or 3 financial advisors sometime in 2020. Do yourself a favor, just pick the right one. It can change your life. Hire the wrong one, it can change your life. Be careful. Well, thanks, Fred and Ryan. We'll be back back next week.
Back in 1
on the
week.
17th with Paul Ruedi's on the mic.
Great.
Thanks, guys.